Hello and welcome to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, India celebrated its 71st Republic Day on Sunday, a day on which the Constitution of India came into effect on 26th of January 1950, replacing effectively the Government of India Act as the governing document of India and in turn turning the nation into a newly formed republic. It was also incidentally the 175th day of curfew in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Now, the besieged valley of 8 million has been in complete lockdown since August 5th of last year, with hundreds of thousands in military present, complete communication lockdown. Meanwhile, protesters against the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 that offers citizenship to non-Muslim minorities from Muslim nations, namely Bangladesh, Afghanistan and Pakistan, those protesters continued their protest in New Delhi's Shaheen Bagh. Protesters in Kolkata also formed a human chain on one of the roads there to show opposition to this legislation, while a huge rally also took place on the outskirts of Mumbai. Now, this is all taking place on the Republic Day as well. Meanwhile, in Assam, the state that has seen many of these protests against the CAA, but also the national registration of citizens, there were 4 blasts early Sunday morning. Thankfully, no casualties were reported so far, according to the police. So we will be talking to our guest today to reflect on India's Republic Day at a time where the outlook of what was once India's image, the world's biggest democracy, has been changing, especially in the past few months with BJP-led governments, Hindutva-led policies in the World Forum. So we will be talking to analysts. With us today, we have Mr. Nishant Varma. He's a analyst joining us from Delhi. We also have Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, also an analyst and the chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global. And he himself comes from Indian-occupied Kashmir and at the moment is living in exile here in London. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Varma. At this day, India is seeing a lot of protests, a lot of people out on the streets criticizing policies that the BJP government has taken very rapidly, especially in the past 5 months. What are your sentiments today as you see, especially yesterday's event on Republic Day being celebrated and protests side by side in India?
71st Republic Day was celebrated yesterday in India. And the beauty of this democracy is that while we celebrate our constitutional day, we also have a segment of people. When I say segment, it does not belong to any caste, creed or religion that I am pointing out. It's a big mass in India which is opposing the rightly pointed out Amendment Act of Citizenship in 2019 that has come up. The reason primarily for that is because there's a large segment of people who do not agree with the discrimination by the name of taking few religions into consideration and not the others, which is, as per most of us that I know, a violation of Article 14 and other articles relevant in that regard of the Constitution of India. Now, there definitely is an uproar in the society right through the length and breadth of this country, not leaving any state aside, ruled by any party that is irrelevant. Now, the uproar is about having this law, which many of us, I include myself into it, as a black law, which has been imposed on this country. Now, primarily, we would always love to have a dialogue with the government in order to either pull this law down or the government makes us understand what is going on regarding this law. But unfortunately, now I suppose the ball is in the Honorable Supreme Court of India's court because several petitions, more than 160 petitions in this regard have been filed. And we await the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court whether the CAA, as we call it, Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, along with the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, and the NPR, National Population Register, whether it's a vicious circle or how it impacts people.
But Mr. Varma, you mentioned the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had over 140, I believe, petitions filed against the CAA. And the Supreme Court didn't come out with a stay on the law. Instead, it just said that the government had 4 weeks to respond. A lot of analysts are saying this was a huge setback to the expectations of those who are out on the streets to the tune of thousands, challenging the government to take back the law.
See, the Honorable Supreme Court of India has taken the right stand, and I'll say how, and I can explain that. We understand that the NPR, the National Population Register, will come in effect from 1st April 2020. And based on that, the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 may not violate the rights confirmed and conferred to several citizens of India, especially as we call for the Muslim citizens, which are being discriminated as per the new law. So, 1st of April 2019 is the beginning process by virtue of which may not impact India. That the judgment will tell us. Then at this point in time, not providing the stay on the CAA 2019 is valid. It was not a hurry to get a stay on it, although a stay on it was always desired. I hope this clarifies.
But Mr. Varma, also help us understand a little how the critics have been talking about the CAA being very anti-constitutional.
Yes, I personally would also criticize the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 on a few counts. Number one, primarily because, as per me also, it violates the Article 14, which is equality irrelevant of any religion. My prima facie case is that when the Article 14 of equality is a burden on every citizen of India, it is also a burden on every law that is made in this country. It cannot be segregated. Number two, while there's a dialogue happening and debate happening in India that why Pakistan or Afghanistan or Bangladeshi Muslims are not to be considered in the same in the same benchmark, there's a debate happening that while the RSS, the mother body of BJP, the current governing party in India, considers every Muslim, especially in this, Akhand Bharat that they call, from Afghanistan to Myanmar. If they consider, and they've been preaching all of us, that every Muslim on this land has a Hindu purvaj, that means antecedents come from Hindus, then by dividing the country into two parts in 1947, the Muslims of Pakistan, Afghanistan and Bangladesh would also primarily fall in the same lineage of having Hindu ancestors. There's a dialogue and debate happening. So these are the kind of things that are unclear from the government of India. And yes, the brute numbers in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha.
So this is the ongoing conversation you're talking about in India at the moment. Mr. Varma, thank you so much for your time and analysis here. Coming to you, Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, as the 71st Republic Day was being celebrated just on Sunday, at the same time, it doesn't go behind doors, or it is not unheard of, the reports coming out. In fact, the Indian government itself has in the past few weeks admitted that to the tune of 5,000 people were detained since August 5th in Jammu and Kashmir. Recent reports from human rights activists and organizations, they're talking about a larger number. Something like 13,000 have been arrested, out of which nearly 5,000 were booked under the very controversial Public Safety Act. On this sort of occasion, what are your thoughts about sort of revering an Indian constitution that talked nothing about the kind of barbaric methods the BJP government has employed in Jammu and Kashmir?
Thank you, Ayza, for the opportunity, this humble opportunity about representing the voice of people. As you rightly said, the current government is really a fascist government whose aim and objective is not just not follow the constitution, but the bigger picture of Akhand Bharat, backed up by the RSS ideology. A little consideration has been given by the current fascist government to the Constitution of India, which promises equal opportunities, human rights, equality to all people living in India, irrespective of their religion, caste, creed, or background. The reality on the ground, as we have seen for the last, since the CAA and RC bill, the current government is hell bent on enforcing the Hindutva regime within India. It has taken the constitutional rights away. In Kashmir, particularly since the 5th of August, when the Article 370 and 35A has been revoked, 5,000 is really a conservative number. I remember Imroz Parvez, who's one of the patrons of JKCC, giving an interview a couple of months back. And at that time, the figure given was around 40,000 youth were imprisoned and kidnapped during the nights. Unfortunately, we don't have an accurate number due to the blockade of communications, NGOs into Kashmir. So getting the real number and the real situation from the ground itself is challenging. And again, this is in violation to the freedom of speech, freedom of movement that the government has imposed. Recently, the latest report that we had from the grounds, over 139 people have been killed. Around estimation of 70,000 people have been arrested by this current government, and we don't know what's happening to these. Some of these people have been sent to the mainland India, imprisoned there without any access to trial. Their families are unable to see them. We heard the reports day before yesterday that the Indian government was going to open up the 2G communication internet. Again, that was shut down yesterday at 6 a.m. and it was really available for a couple of minutes with a limited accessibility to only 300 chosen websites that the government believes people can access. There is a lot of human rights violation. There's a lot of activity that's happening in Kashmir, which is against the Indians' own constitution. One of the things that Vishad Marwa just mentioned, when we talked about CAA and RC, was the current government believes that in 1947, the partition took place based on a religion, and the Muslims chose to go to Bangladesh or Pakistan. The Kashmiri people, which is a majority Muslim state, haven't been given that right of self-determination till yet. And the Indian-owned constitution, which has an obligation to respect the international laws, are not being adhered to.
Now, that's interesting you mentioned here, Mr. Let me just intervene because, at a time where the international forum, it seems to be finally reacting in somewhat a manner that seems to recognize what is happening on the ground there in Jammu and Kashmir is in violation to these international laws. I mean, we just saw reports coming in that besides the international sort of statements and parliamentary resolutions, the European Parliament is going to be working on these 6 resolutions that very critically take in what is happening in Jammu and Kashmir. And they're expected in a few days to come out with with the majority of the members condemning it. Now, the kind of international attention this is coming, that it's getting today, would you say this is unprecedented, that finally the voice of those who are besieged in this valley is being heard?
Indeed, the international community is taking a notice on what's happening in Kashmir as well as India across. There has been definitely an unprecedented awareness and attention that the international community, especially because of I'm really thankful to the media fraternity that have really given such an exposure on the human rights violations and the act of state terrorism that the Indian government is doing in Kashmir. So yes, you rightly said the European Parliament already had one hearing this week, and they're about to put a resolution through on the 29th of this month where they're declaring the CAA and NRC to be one of the biggest major blockers against equality and discrimination on the Muslim side. So that is a massive development that's happening on the international community. But I do believe a lot more needs to be happening and a lot more needs to be done. Apart from passing the resolutions, I think there needs to be a tangible involvement of the international community to stop the repeat of a history. We've already seen this happening back in 1940s in the World War II when the Nazis, the Hitler, used the same strategy as the greater Nazi Hitler's Nazism, and there was a chaos across the world. And what we're seeing now is pretty much a repeat of that history now. And unless the world community comes together and acts tangibly, put some tangible steps in place to stop that from happening, I fear that we might have worse crises happening in Asia.
World community needs to step up to tangible efforts. Here, let me get the comment of Pakistan's permanent representative to the UN, Mr. Munir Akram. He's just joining us from New York today. Welcome, Mr. Akram, to Newswire. You heard Mr. Zaffar Qureshi talking about how this is definitely unprecedented at a time where Jammu and Kashmir is seeing its 175th day of lockdown, of curfews, but the world community has responded. It has shown some movement, some recognition, besides just words of condemnation. Tell us, give us an idea. In the UN, there was again a UNSC closed-door meeting on Kashmir. What are the sentiments on the ground there? I mean, how tangible can we expect these efforts to be from the UN?
Well, as you know, the UN is constituted of member states, and the policies of member states shift very, very cautiously and very slowly. I think the sentiment among people, among diplomats and other people is quite clear. It's very concerned about what's happening in India and what India has done in Jammu and Kashmir. The question is how to shift policy. Policies will shift with public opinion. So we have to work both on public opinion as well as on the policies of member states. I think the results are showing. The media has responded. Member states are concerned. The Security Council has now taken up Jammu and Kashmir for the second time. We are going to raise it in the Human Rights Council. Pressure is working. The Indians are trying to show in a fake way that the normalcy is returning. That is now being exposed as being hollow. There is internal problems in India now with regard to the citizenship laws.
Right.
And the Hindu ideology, which was first raised, by the way, by Prime Minister Imran Khan in the General Assembly, that whatever he said is now becoming visible to the world. And I think we have to maintain the pressure. We have to expose what this fascist government is doing, and hopefully the world will respond credibly.
Now, Mr. Akram, we understand that obviously as member states, they ally themselves with other member states according to not just sort of ideology, but mostly because of the geopolitical importance, the long-term strategy in the region, and also largely economy. India has obviously boasted, a very sort of world's fifth largest economy. But when words of BJP legislators come out, like for example, Sumashka Reddy, he came out recently in a rally, said something to the effect. In fact, let me just read out one of his quotes. He said, "Be careful because we are 80% of the population, while you," and he's referring to the Muslims here, just 15%. "You are just a minority, and I want you to think that what will happen if the majority comes out on the streets against you all." Now, this is just one of the many BJP legislators who have said this kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric. Along with that, there have been recorded letters, threatening letters to mosques that have been published in newspapers and media. I mean, this perception must be this news must be coming across very loud and clear to the UN family. I mean, they must be looking at this, and their perceptions must be affected by how they want to move forward with taking India's side.
Yes, that's true. I think at the individual level, everybody is extremely concerned and condemnatory of the Indian postures. But the policies of states are dictated by national interest, and as you have yourself mentioned, many states have political or strategic considerations vis-a-vis India. For example, the U.S. has a strategic alliance to use India as a counter to China. There is economic considerations and so forth. So states will adopt cautious policies, but the needle is moving. The perception of India is changing. It is now, as the economist said, intolerant India, but that's even a mild censure. I think it's a fascist India. It's an aggressive India, and that aggression will become visible within India as protests are mounted, and it will become visible in the world. But the BJP has launched a Nazi-like campaign of fear inside India, and it is using the same strong-arm tactics in its diplomacy of bullying and threatening countries, and therefore responses from smaller countries are careful, and we have to work against that, and we are working against that.
There are also concerns now with what the relationship of India with the European Union is going to start looking like in the next few weeks, especially because there has been news that about 6 different resolutions, on both Jammu and Kashmir and also the Citizenship Amendment Act, that 6 of these have been filed, and it is expected that an overwhelming majority of members from the European Parliament are going to be voting on this against the government of India. I mean, this is reflecting on when you say that the needle is moving on the kind of activity and the kind of awareness being spread by different members, UN member states, that the kind of awareness that this is spreading and the kind of repercussions it can get from the world community.
Yes, of course. European Parliament resolutions are enormously important because they will affect the policies of the member states of the European Union. That, of course, they are not binding, so it will take time, and we have to work, therefore, not only at the parliamentary level but also at the government level, and push for the point of view to reveal really what's happening in India. It's a long fight. We have to pursue it, and hopefully we will get allies and friends to pursue it with us.
All right, Mr. Munir Akram joining us there from New York. Thank you so much for your input there. Coming back to you, Mr. Qureshi, I mentioned this with Mr. Akram. Of course, it's the national interest of each member state on how they want to align themselves with other member states. But when it comes to India, while it used to boost an incredible economy of late, since the Modi won the second landslide victory in the 2019 elections, it seems like even that is going out of its favor. Do you see that working in the favor of Kashmiris right now? The fact, even though it's a double-edged sword, obviously Jammu and Kashmir has lost a lot of business since August 5th, but in terms of kind of losing the incentive in the world community to not speak up against those in Kashmir.
The current crisis definitely are in favor of what's happening in Kashmir. I think the world is coming to the realization that actually what India claimed to be a secular democratic country, tolerant to all religions, or what they called as incredible India, is now actually an intolerant India. The economy of India is shrinking quite heavily. We're actually seeing that even though, yes, it's got a massive population, it actually doesn't have that much of a purchasing or economical strength. So the world's also realizing how intolerant and how the minorities are treated, how the Indian current fascist government is, committing atrocities or discriminations and not adhering to the principles that it claims to be. So it definitely is working in our favor. As you said, we've got 6 resolutions coming in the European Parliament. We had the United Nations Security Council closed-door meetings. I think, yes, the world community, the way it's reacting at the moment, is becoming more favorable to the Kashmir cause, to the Kashmir issue. Right. It is providing us an opportunity, a platform to raise our voices. And as I said before, a lot more needs to be done. We do need to interact with the governments. We do need to make sure that our message is clear, that while we're in solidarity with the people of India because of what's happening to them on the discrimination basis, right, but the struggle of Kashmir for freedom has been there for long, over 73 years, and it is for complete freedom from the illegal occupation, not equal rights within the Constitution.
That's a good point here, because the BJP government is on a roll on not just imploding on itself within its borders, but also highlighting in turn with the kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric they have indirectly, or in some cases, as some BJP lawmakers have come straight out, directly shown. But tell me this, what happens next? I mean, if one were to look at it a few months from now, hopefully much sooner, what will be the scenario like in Jammu and Kashmir after these curfews, after this heavy deployment of military is moved out and Kashmiris are finally, able to live their life normally? How will they react? What will the situation be like then on the ground? Is there any fear of a very violent reaction?
To be honest, that is $1 billion question, and one which is very hard to be certain about, especially with the lack of communication, accessibility to Kashmir. I think there's a lot of anger and resentment within the Kashmiri people, and that is growing. Up till now, India has only been able to keep that under the lid due to the heavy armed forces. I am concerned, and we all Kashmiris in the diaspora, even the peace-loving community across the globe, is worried that once things are back to so-called normal and there's a little bit of rubbish, that the people, the sentiments may actually explode and there may be a unprecedented chaos in the valley. And that's something this needs to be taken into consideration on. Look, you've besieged people for over 6 months. You've denied them their basic freedom right? A right to communication, right to live safely, security, without any access to the outside world. This will, it won't yield a peaceful solution, but a more resentment. For last 73 years, all we've been seeing is state terrorism, rape, torture, death, and now our basic rights have been taken. So I think there's, there are more chances that the people of Kashmir. Absolutely.
There's a real fear that it's going to explode and the situation might get out of hand. It's a good point that something that needs to be kept in mind as progress is made, somewhat hopefully on the World Forum, on how this is going to be resolved. But we've run out of time there. Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, thank you so much for staying with us here and giving us your input. We'll take a quick short break here. When we're back, we'll talk about what's happening in Iraq as the protesters are once again out on the streets asking for a change of government. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, Iraqi forces have made renewed efforts to end the sit-ins that the protesters are right now part of and to restore order in major parts of the country. Now, this is happening just hours after a very, very popular cleric, al-Sadr, who also heads the largest coalition in parliament and had millions of supporters in Baghdad and in the south, come out and announce that he would end his involvement in these anti-government protests. Now, these protests in Iraq, we've been covering them extensively on Newswire. We've been talking about that they've been going on for months, and they've been essentially against a corrupt ruling elite and lack of basic amenities, a spiraling economy, and high unemployment. But after the January 3rd assassination from a US airstrike of an Iranian IRGC commander, General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, the Iraqi youth had started demanding that the exit of US troops from Iraq take place immediately. So amid these growing calls for an end to foreign interference in Iraq, the Iraqi parliament on January 5th also backed a resolution for all foreign troops, including 5,200 US soldiers, to leave Iraq. Now, while Iraq has been struggling with this since October 2019, the protest that is, and trying to quell what is by some analysts being seen as one of the largest protests in its recent history, it's also grappling with the ongoing US-Iran tensions, which it seems they're using Baghdad as their battleground for their own fight. Now, Iran has responded to Soleimani's assassination, as we saw in the past few weeks, by sending a volley of missiles in Iraq, targeting US bases. Since then, 2 more such attacks have taken place. One took place just Sunday night, where 3 rockets hit the US embassy directly in Baghdad's heavily fortified green zone. But the sudden withdrawal of support that we see from al-Sadr, that has become possibly the biggest setback for the protesters yet. So what we're looking to investigate today is, why did al-Sadr suddenly withdraw support? Sadr's office has come out and said that the protests have been cancelled because they don't want to, that they want to avoid internal strife, and also that the real reason is that they don't want Iraq heading into another war. But is that the real reason? We'll be talking to our analysts to get insight into what this could mean for the protesters and what they think is the real reason behind him withdrawing. Let's find out more. Let me introduce our guest. We have with us Mr. Zeidon Al-Kinani. He's a political analyst and writer, and he specializes in geopolitics and identity politics, primarily on Iraq. So he's joining us from Doha today. We also have Mr. Mohammed Hussain. He's the policy director at Iraqi Center for Policy Analysis and Research, and also an independent research center, which is in Baghdad. We are also joined by Mr. Guy Burton. He's the adjunct professor of international relations at Vesalius College in Brussels. Welcome to all three of you to this conversation. I want to start with you, Mr. Zeidon Al-Kinani, on your take on what or why did suddenly Muqtada al-Sadr announce that he was withdrawing support for the protesters?
Yeah, well, before we try to make sense or try to understand Muqtada al-Sadr's actions today in Iraq, post-October 2019 Iraq, which is the uprisings that began 3 or 4 months ago, we have to understand the relationship of Sadr with Iran and his role in the current protests. So starting with his relationship with Iran, he has always tried to portray himself as the anti-Iran Shia figure in Iraq. And that was a way of him buying the hearts and the minds of probably most of the people in the Shia component of the Iraqi society, and many Sunnis and Kurds as well, both regular citizens and politicians, because he was seen as that Shia political leader who promoted for a nationalist, unified, collective Iraqi identity against the Iranian aggression or against the Iranian influence, if you will. But then throughout the years, we're realizing, especially now as we came closer to the protests that began in October, is that he realized that he wasn't that welcomed on the streets in the protest movement. The protest movement was very clear that their demand for better employability rates and the downfall of an ethnic sectarian regime that has failed to provide better living standards, better education, better healthcare, better infrastructure, better electricity for the past 16 years is the very same government that he's part of. There has been so many governments since 2003 where he had sometimes 6 ministries under his political coalition or his political administration. So that is even why his involvement in or his participation in the October Revolution was minimal, and it came a few weeks later because he was very worried that the anti-Iran sentiment and the anti-Iraqi governmental sentiment on the streets in Iraq included him. They even created a hashtag for him on Twitter called La Tarkab al-Mawja, which means don't jump on the wave, in a way of calling him not to jump on the trendy policy or on the trendy wave in Iraq, and that is being anti-government, anti-Iran, and anti-everything that caused the destruction of Iraq. Anyways, he did join the protest movement after all. Not a lot of people welcomed it. We have to differentiate between Muqtada al-Sadr and his followers, the Sadrist movement, who are millions of ordinary citizens. A lot of them may agree with the protest movement on the streets in Iraq, and a lot of them wouldn't. But after all, they're still Iraqi citizens who find a lot of commonalities in their struggle against the ethnic sectarian regime in Iraq. A lot of the members of the Sadrist movement are people who inherited their membership or allegiance to the Sadrist movement from their families or from their neighbors or from the neighborhoods they come from. So they after all, they found a way to jump into the protest movement, but Sadr kind of realized that he didn't gain the credit that he wanted from the protest movement. Not only he tried to create himself as a spiritual leader of that protest movement, but even the Iraqi government or the Iraqi governmental media propaganda tried to create this discourse that these are protests that he are pushing for his own interests, for his own agenda. And the protest movement tried to make it very clear from the beginning, and they continuously tried to counter that propaganda that was created by the Iraqi government, that he is not the spiritual leader of the Iraqi government. Right. In fact, he is a part of the ethnic sectarian regime, which they are protesting against. And this is when Iran comes into the picture.
But hold that thought. Let me get in Mr. Hussain's also his opinion here. Also, Mr. Hussain, your take on this, on the Sadrists giving that kind of support, Muqtada al-Sadr itself also giving the kind of physical protection to protesters from pro-Iranian militias. Do you think that was overplayed maybe on al-Sadr's part, or in reality it did have that kind of effect in terms of the protection it provided to Iraqi protesters on the street?
Well, there is no doubt that the Sadr movement is protection for the Iraqi protesters in Baghdad, Basra, Diwania, Karbala, and even in Nasiriyah. It played a big role in keeping the protesters in the past 4 months. Mm-hmm. And it also played a big role in protecting the ordinary protesters on the streets from the Iranian-backed militias and snipers. Mm-hmm. But contrary to what many people expected and many observers expected, that Sadr's withdrawal of his support for the protesters did not play, and so far it has not played a big role in let's say, reducing the scale of the protests. Mm-hmm. Just hours after the Muqtada Sadr's declaration of withdrawing his support from the protest-designated areas that we call Sahat al-Aqsam in Iraq, so thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, like students, normal middle-class people, just joined the protests. Actually, in some cities and towns, the number of people who attended protests yesterday and day before yesterday by far increased comparing to the time where Sadr's followers protecting the protesters.
Okay, so but
yes, Sadr by cooperating with the protesters played a big role, but by withdrawing from
it doesn't. You're saying it doesn't have that kind of impact one would have expected, a negative impact on the protests. Mr. Guy Burton, your take on this? Also, considering that both our guests are here saying that it didn't really have his role was not that sort of detrimental to the success or the failure of these protests here. It didn't affect them as such. But since he called off the support or had withdrawn, it seems as if it was like a subtle green light to the government, to the security forces, who once again came out with very aggressive tactics. 12 people since his announcement of withdrawing support have been killed in these protests as a result.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show again. And I mean, to sort of follow on from what some of the previous contributors have said, I mean, the thing about it's worth keeping in mind that, the presence of the protests is not just a criticism of, the failure of governance, the failure of economic opportunities and unemployment. It's also a criticism of Iran's influence in Iraq as well. And I think one of the things that the Iranians have become deeply concerned about in the last month or so, certainly with the inability to be able to see a new government formed, that sort of the people that they had on their watch, the Shia political leaders didn't seem to be able to control the protesters, and so there has been more Iranian interest in al-Sadr, and so of course there might well be a developing relationship going on there. I also think, the Iranians feel threatened by the protests. And so certainly, yes, this sort of removal of government involvement has sort of allowed, the actions that you just talked about to take place. But what's also interesting as well is that, the protests themselves are becoming increasingly autonomous. So there is certainly there was a sense that the Soleimani killing sort of diverted attention away from the protests at the beginning of the month. Increasingly, there's been an attempt by protesters to pull back attention to it and to stress that they are not only against America, they're against Iran as well. They want autonomy. And what we're seeing as a result is the emergence of, individual activists who are becoming much more important as well. And that will also constitute a threat, not only for al-Sadr, but the other political leaders.
So we've established here that what al-Sadr was and that the protest is still going to continue. It seems like they are not being appeased by any kind of efforts by the caretaker government to establish a new government. Coming back to you, Mr. Zeidon Al-Kinani, I mean, there was on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum a very sort of talked about meeting that the US President Donald Trump had with the leader of Iraq's Kurdish regional government. That is being taken by some analysts as the agenda that US has been trying to promote here, especially since Iraq's government, after the Qasem Soleimani assassination, came out and decided that we do not want US troops on the ground anymore. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, well, the whole idea of calling for the withdrawal of the U.S. troops, I was going to comment on that earlier when you mentioned in your report that it wasn't regular protesters, or it wasn't protesters of the same people of the protest movement that called out for the withdrawal of the U.S. troops out of Iraq. That was a plot orchestrated by Iran to pull the attention away from the protest movement, which heavily carried a very heavy anti-Iran sentiment, as one of our guests mentioned. So the whole idea of calling for the withdrawal of the U.S. troops of Iraq is to flip this entire struggle of the protest movement against the regime, against the Iranian influence, against the poor living standards, and so on, to turn it into an Iran-U.S. conflict. And when Iran was trying to take the moral ground in convincing Iraqis that they are trying to protect Iraqi sovereignty against the U.S. military presence in Iraq, as if the U.S. military presence in Iraq hasn't been existing for the past 16 years. And Muqtada al-Sadr is a person who found an opportunity to join momentum, because both him and Iran realize that the killing of Soleimani and Mohandes leaves a power vacuum for someone like him. Iran knows very, very well that Muqtada al-Sadr has a very prominent and significant influence on the Iraqi streets.
So hold that thought. We've just got the last seconds, and Mr. Burton, I quickly want to get your comments on this, especially this power vacuum that Mr. Zeidon has just pointed out. Very quickly, if you could give us your take on how the U.S. and with Iran trying to sort of dismantle Iran's control over Iraq or presence in Iraq, how is this going to affect what the Iraqi protesters have been demanding? I mean, how is this going to move forward in the next few months?
Well, so really the problem, the big challenge in Iraq is that you have a number of different sort of tensions and conflicts taking place at the moment. Obviously there's the protest movement that's taking place, which has got domestic reasons, but it's also got an international dimension because, Iraq is effectively becoming sort of a theater, a playground for, sort of rivalry between the Americans and the Iranians. Now, in an ideal world, the solution to all of this is for both the Americans and the Iranians to step back, for the political leaders in Iraq to respond, positively towards the protesters. But unfortunately, we seem to be in a situation where it's escalation on both sides, whether it's the Americans, or the Iranians, or even the Iraqi political leaders. They see this very much as a zero-sum game. So some concession on their side is seen as a failure. It's seen as giving up.
Okay, Mr. Guy Burton, thank you so much. Mr. Zeidon, Al-Kinani and Mr. Mohammed Hussain for this very quick conversation over how this withdrawal of support from Muqtada al-Sadr is going to affect the protesters. Not much, it seems, but the power vacuum as it is, we are seeing being left behind as the US-Iran proxy tensions sort of explode in Iraq, really do affect the protesters themselves. Now, with that, we've come to the end of the program. We'll see you tomorrow with more news and analysis. Till then, goodbye.